Windows tools and diagnostics. In this nugget, we address various Windows tools and diagnostics. This is just kind of a potpourri, so to speak, of various miscellaneous and assorted things such as runline utilities that we haven't covered yet, also various administrative tools, and also computer management. Isn't it amazing how some things just kind of pile up? I just went to Walmart for a couple little items. I wanted to go get some chocolate peanut butter cup ice cream. Okay, I have to admit that's a weakness of mine. And I also needed just to get some soap for cleaning. And by the time I left Walmart, though, I was going down all the aisles and everything, and I saw so many other things that we needed that I kept forgetting to buy on earlier trips that my shopping cart got kind of full. And by the time I went through the checkout line, it all added up pretty fast. And then I realized, wow, that adds up really fast. It's kind of like that right now with our current topic, as we're working with a bunch of Windows utilities and things. Some of these didn't have their own individual subject in previous nuggets, but nevertheless, we need to cover them because they are part of the A+ exam objectives. So we're going to kind of cover these little bite-sized topics one at a time here in this nugget. And to get started with this, I'm going to return to the command prompt where we addressed several other commands in a previous nugget, and now we're going to kind of clean up with the remaining ones. But I do want to point out that whatever the command is that you're interested in working with, you can find out more about that command, including its available switches or options as they're sometimes called, as well as the syntax that you're supposed to use, just by following it with the /question mark. So, for example, we used dir in a previous nugget to show a directory listing. If I follow that with a /question mark, then that gives me all of the syntax and the various options that I can use with this. Of course, if it's too much to fit in one screen, it'll tell you down here at the bottom to press any key to continue, which I'll do here, and you can see that, again, you get more. Now, I don't think you're going to have to memorize, all of the available switches and everything, but I will focus on some of those that might be of more importance that you might need to know about. Now, for the rest of the commands that are listed in the A+ exam objectives, and there's still several there. There's msconfig, check disk, edit, which I just described to you, showed you, copy, xcopy format. There's several other different ones that are scattered throughout the objectives. But I think it would be quite tedious if I just went through each one and showed you all of the various parameters and options. So what I've done instead is I've compiled this list of commonly used commands available for you up on nuggetlab.com. Many of these we've already taken a look at. I think, for example, in the last nugget, we might have looked at that, a trib command. And so some of these will look familiar, although there will be additional parameters, and you'll see the full syntax here and everything. This is available for your own study up on NuggetLab. Also, some of these commands are not listed in the A+ exam objectives, but I just think that any general administrator would need to know something about some of these additional commands. Now, let me try to see if I can find you a good example. How about, this ipconfig is certainly something that we can use. Oh, path ping. That one's not in the exam objectives, but it's very useful for being able to trace a location of the packets as it goes from one source to a destination. It's similar to the traceroute command, which is also a tool that does a similar function, but the path ping tool is more efficient and actually more thorough is a better way to say that. So there's several different commands that are available for you here on that document. Now, certain other tools I'm still going to continue to show you, especially one that might expose additional options or a UI, such as what's one of the msconfig is one that Microsoft has on here. Notice that when I click on the Start menu, then I get a Start Search item here. In previous versions of Windows, like 2000 and XP, this would have been the Run line. Well, we don't really get the run line anymore. If you really want to run, then you have to hold down the Windows key on the keyboard and press R, and that would then expose the run command that we see here. One of the advantages I like of using this is that it has memory, so it'll remember the last few commands that I've typed in. I've only done one, apparently, in this particular instance, but it will have memory, whereas this search item does not. So if I wanted to do msconfig, for example, I could type that in and then press Enter. Now, the only reason why it would actually run msconfig at this point is because it found, this is actually a search bar, it found what I was looking for, and by pressing Enter, notice that it's kind of highlighted a little bit blue right there. That's pretty much the same as clicking on it. So by pressing Enter, now we will launch that. We have to have user account control going on here. And now we can adjust certain things that might help make troubleshooting a little bit easier, or if not easier, at least help us to narrow down the scope of problems that we can try to address. So what's this tool used for, by the way? This is a very useful tool for diagnosing startup problems or problems with programs that are loading when you log on, or services that are loading when you log on. Some of those might be hanging or causing the system to freeze or something like this. So what I can do is to use this tool in a diagnostic service, a startup, so that it will only load basic devices and services. And if it seems to start up normally at this stage, that's a pretty good indication that something in this services or startup programs is causing a problem. And then I might start to attack those two tabs there and to exclude things that I suspect might be causing the problem. And of course, this tool, as well as many of the others that we will use here, also partially address really the troubleshooting items and troubleshooting objectives that also exist in the A+ exam. All right, so we have the diagnostic startup. We also have the selective startup. If I am suspicious that it really is a system service that's causing a problem, then I might just load only the startup items and leave out the system services. Now, if the system starts up properly, then I know for sure that it's one of those system services, and again, I would go to that particular tab. And then to show you around some of those things, what if I suspected that some of the system services were causing a problem? Well, with this, what it will do is it's going to disable all of these, because notice that none of these are selected. So what I might do is to enable all of them if I suspect a specific item, and I don't know, whatever this thing is right here. Then I might clear that item, and then if the system starts up normally or whatever the problem is goes away, I know that it was that specific item that we had deselected. And then along a similar vein, you can do the same kind of thing with startup items. These are things that are starting up. If I suspect that some of these are causing a problem, like maybe it's this Adobe Acrobat stuff right here, well, then I'll disable those items. Again, problem goes away. It proves that it had something to do with those items. Then there's also the boot parameters here. This is very similar to what you can get in the system properties, where you can adjust the boot properties there. But other things I could do is for example, is to change the timeout, which really only relates to if I have multiple operating systems that I want to kind of dual boot from, for example. Or if I want to boot into safe mode, this is kind of useful because sometimes it's really hard to hit the F5 key or the F8 key in time when the system restarts. You got to really have a narrow window of time there. So if I can at least get to this interface in a normally booted up Windows, then I can choose to go to safe mode the next time. And some of these things, by the way, as well, depending on your application vendor, they will identify various things that you need to, enable or disable. It is a matter of troubleshooting their product. And then here I've switched over to tools. This is really, you can get these anywhere. I mean, you can get these from a number of different locations. But for example, maybe user account control is causing me a problem right here. Well, I could launch the disable user account control. Some applications don't like user account control. They don't like that interruption for whatever reason, so it might have to be disabled. Once again, I recommend not doing that if at all possible. And you see a number of other commands or tools that we could use here as well. Now then, that tool that I just showed you is also available under Administrative Tools if you have that on your Start menu. Under System Configuration, you can see here that it's the exact same thing that you can get from typing msconfig from the command line. However, there's another one that I'm about to show you that doesn't appear on the Start menu, and that would be msinfo32. Okay? By launching this, you can see it gives you a good survey or a good overview, bird's eye look at your system. Okay, the operating system that you're running, the page file data, the processors that you have, the memory, all those sorts of things appear here. And then one thing that's also pretty cool is this hardware resources item. For example, you can look at the conflicts and the sharing. Now, with the Advanced Configuration Power Interface, or ACPI, this is not as critical as it used to be with older hardware, where that you could not share interrupt requests, such as the interrupt request here that's being shared. Also, before we had only 16 interrupt requests. Now you can get like 100 interrupt requests, or however many you want, really. So very rarely do we have conflicts anymore, although you certainly can have sharing. And if we go down to the interrupt requests down here, for example, let me expand this out a little bit, you'll see that I've got interrupt requests down here into the 190. So plenty of IRQs, whereas in the past, those were quite tight in terms of the sharing and compatibility and conflicts. Then in addition, we have various components that you can take a look at here as well. Now, these are some things that would not be as easily exposed using other interfaces, such as Device Manager. If I take my look at my CD-ROM here, for example. In Device Manager, I can see what the drivers are that are installed, and we can see that here as well. I can also see some other information about it, but to get all of this information, you'd pretty much have to go through the drop-down list within Device Manager and keep changing categories of data that you're looking at. Here, it kind of presents it to me all in one location, and it gives me the vendor and so forth. And so that's kind of cool. And that same would be true of a lot of the rest of these things that we see here. So it's a pretty good way of getting an overall view of the hardware components. And then you can also take a look at the system environment, such as signed drivers. This is pretty important because a lot of times you might not have signed drivers. Now, Microsoft does recommend that you use only signed drivers. That means that they're going to be more stable and that they will have been tested and signed by Microsoft. But here, if you want to sort according to whether or not they're signed, you can click on the sort column. And of course, I don't know what this is supposed to mean, but not available, not signed. So who knows what that means. But the rest of these, it'll just tell you whether or not they're not available. Most of the ones that are not available are actually supplied by Microsoft for legacy purposes, for backwards compatibility with older hardware. But the rest of these, you can see here, are all signed. And so that's good news there. But this gets you started on a lot of the different kinds of things that you can take a look at for using MS Info 32. And again, just kind of a good way to get information. It doesn't diagnose anything, doesn't fix anything, but it does provide information to you. Another cool utility that again doesn't seem to appear on the Start menu directly would be DXDiag. Now this is something that's been used in the past just to check whether or not you're compatible with DirectX kinds of components. Just about everything is these days. But notice that at the beginning here, it tells me I can also check to see if something's digitally signed or not. And I'll go ahead and say yes to that, which extends a little bit the time that it loads, but it doesn't take too terribly long. And the purpose for this, initially, again, is to identify whether or not we can run DirectX. The thing is, this is actually very good for, again, an overview of the rest of the system. Here, again, I get some of the same kind of information that we were looking at before, but it's, again, a very easy-to-read format here. It tells me how much memory I've got, what my paging file size is like, if I have DirectX already available, and what version it is. And all the rest of this, I think, pretty well explains itself. Then we go to the display. And the display, of course, is critically important for DirectX compatibility. And then if you actually have a higher-end video card, then it would give you more data in this. Since I'm using VMware, it just kind of uses an emulator to be able to create the display at all. So it doesn't really have all the fancy graphic components that you would normally see in this. But then again, it'll also tell you if there's any problems that are found directly related to the capability of using DirectX. And then the same thing would be true of sound. If you have a higher-end sound card, then you might have additional data within this. But again, I just have kind of a basic sound going on right now. And then if you have any inputs going on as well, it shows you what's going into the system. And once again, if there's any problems found. So again, none of this diagnoses anything, none of this fixes any problems, but all these tools so far give you great information, and they could identify problems that you might be having. So you can at least know where to start if you can identify where the problem is coming from. And then for the last one, I'm going to return to the command prompt. Now again, most of these are what the A+ exam will call run line utilities, but for this particular one will give us more information from the command prompt because I want to show you something else here as we go. But I'm just going to have to run this as administrator, which is what the SFC command must be run as administrator. And I mentioned earlier that you can type a command followed by a /question mark to get all the parameters. And what I want to show you here is the purpose of this tool. And its purpose is to scan the system files to make sure that nothing's been corrupt or improperly overwritten. A lot of times, Trojans and viruses and other malware will replace known good Windows files with their own version, which could have some kind of an exploit in it or something like that. Or it could just be poorly designed software that might have overwritten one of your own system files. So in here, I want to do something like this. Normally, we would do SFC and then followed by a /scan now. And then if it has access to your source files, like the DVD that Windows came on, for example, then it will replace any known bad files with the good ones from the DVD, okay? Or from a service pack, for example. But in our case, I just want to verify only. So I'll do an SFC / verify only, and I just want to see if there's any problems with any of the files. And sometimes you'll get a false positive, but most of the time it will also take quite a bit of time to run. So you do need to give this a few minutes to run. I'm just going to kind of wait on that, and I'll pause recording until it's finished. That's going to take a long time, so it's still churning away after several minutes here, so I'll just let it continue to do its thing. But what I want to do next is to talk to you about a couple of other interfaces. These are additional administrative tools that we can use to gather information, and some of these are also actually useful for fixing things rather than just reporting. And then while I'm waiting for that to complete, once again here, I'll go to Windows 2000, where we go to My Network Places. Now, this is getting pretty old. We don't really use this much anymore, especially in the way that it was originally designed, because Microsoft wanted us to be able to double-click on this thing, and then to look for things like the entire network. And then they envisioned users being able to find the entire contents of Active Directory, which is what I'm looking at here. That's my AccuSource domain that I work with. But then what do users do? Well, let me see here. Users, guest, what do I do with that? Can I delete this person? No. There's really not much use for the end user to be in here at all. In fact, even administrators that have Active Directory privileges, like domain admins, would never use this. They would just use Active Directory users and computers, which is the Active Directory tool useful for administering those users. So this whole branch of exploration is really not worth much, I don't think, in terms of even administration or end users. But this might have some use, the Microsoft Windows Network item, where people could double-click through this thing and they could look for, workgroup computers, or they could double-click again through the domain that we see right here and find computers and so forth. The thing with that is they could browse for resources. So, for example, let me show you. If I go and double-click on DC1, which is one of the computers that was in there, we can see that we have a number of different resources in here that we could browse through. Okay, but that, again, is not really very useful either, because if this is an important share that the user actually needs, chances are administrators in a corporation will have already mapped a network drive for that user. They don't really have any need to do that. So in terms of the usefulness for double-clicking your way through My Network Places, not really a whole awful lot there. In terms of administration for IT professionals like A+ technicians, we could go to the properties of My Network Places, and here we're likely to get some more information that we'll need to work with. For example, if we needed to make a new connection, such as if we needed to create a VPN to another computer, which is a virtual private network, which gives you a secure connection to that other computer or network, you could do that. You could go to the local area connection here, which is probably more likely where you're able to go. And with this, we could disable this network connection. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, if we're having some problems with this network connection, and especially if you have more than one, we could disable one and see if we still continue to have the problem. And if the problem goes away, we know it has something to do with this particular network connection. In this case, I've only got the one, so I'll just go to the properties and show the other things that we're likely to have to work through. For example, Client for Microsoft Networks is what allows me to browse for resources such as the shares that we saw earlier, or to be able to have mapped drives that I can then click my way through. We can also choose this File and Printer Sharing for Microsoft Networks. We don't really need that unless I'm sharing files or sharing printers here, but if I were to disable this by deselecting that item, and I had nothing to share anyway, I probably wouldn't notice the difference in terms of productivity or anything. But one of the ones that you'll probably more likely access is this Internet Protocol TCP/IP, which is only TCP/IP version 4 in Windows 2000. And for this, we would go to the properties, and you could obtain an IP address automatically, which uses a Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, or DHCP server, to retrieve an IP address. And it would also receive a DNS server from that DHCP server as well. Alternatively, you could use static information by manually typing in all that information. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail with that right now, because we'll talk more about networking in upcoming nuggets. But for the time being, at least know that you do have My Network Places, which with the right click would get you to this interface, which you can then go to the properties for to make changes to your TCP/IP connections and your client and sharing connections. You can see here that I've switched over to XP, and the main difference with My Network Places between XP and 2000 is we don't have it here. I mean, you can get it back if you use the classic start menu, or if you just access the start menu here. Then we can see My Network Places. And then here we have a variety of different shares that are available in the domain. I can choose tools and map a network drive if I like, and I can just browse for the share or something like that if I want to. Okay, just one way of doing this. We might address that more when we talk about networking again in a future nugget. Also, the other interface differences are just what we see over here on the left, where you can have a number of different links to look at those those things, for example, if I wanted to switch to the work group, then I could, of course, click that item that we see there as well. But otherwise, it's mostly just interface differences. One thing I should show you, though, if I want to adjust the properties here, look, if I right-click on My Network Places and choose Properties, then that's a quick and easier way to get to the network connections. Okay. Otherwise, with Windows 2000, we could have done that right on the desktop. With XP and succeeding versions of Windows, it seems like you have to click through more things to get to what you want than we ever had to do in the past. But otherwise, it's pretty much the same. I could just go to the properties here, and again, you can see that we've got the client and the file and printer sharing and TCP/IP down here. Pretty much all of those things are going to be adjusted the same way. The only other thing we have here is the quality of service packet scheduler, which will give priority to certain kinds of packets to make sure that we have good delivery. That would be an important thing for things such as streaming, where you wouldn't want hiccups in a video or something like this. Now then, switching back over here to my Vista computer, we see that SFC did complete and it did not find any integrity violations. Wow, that's kind of a dramatic word. I don't know what they would do if they did find a violation, maybe issue a citation or something. Anyway, what I want to show next here is computer management. This is going to be largely the same on XP and Vista, where you just right-click on Computer or My Computer in XP, choose Manage, and then once we've done that with administrative privilege here in Vista, then it will open up the Computer Management Console. Now, some of the things we've looked at here in the past for other reasons in different nuggets that we've discussed. However, I just want to give a broad overview of this again. One of those things that I want to address is the fact that you can right-click on this and choose Connect to another computer. And provided there's no firewall issues in between your computer and the other computer, you can then connect to that computer and remotely view all the same settings on that destination computer. The only thing you probably can't do is for Device Manager. There are certain things you cannot do, such as update drivers and things like this. For that, you would have to be local. But here I'm just going to start from the top down. If we take a look at this Task Scheduler, and there's a Task Scheduler library here. Now, what we can do with this is there might be a number of things that play into this. You might have some utilities such as, let's see, Executive Software's Disk Keeper, which is what I use for all my clients and servers. When I install it, you can schedule it so that it will automatically defragment at given times. Well, it would add a task scheduler item in here that you could then further edit if you wanted to. Or you might have certain batch files and things like this that you want to run, or scripts that you want to run during various periods of time. And then you can see here that I've kind of abruptly switched over to my domain controller, where we're looking at Server Manager. This is not an A+ issue, but I want to focus right down here because the Task Scheduler library should look pretty much the same on a client as it does here on the server. And since there was nothing to show on a client there, I just wanted to come over here real quick. And you can see here, for example, that I've created a photo backup utility, or rather a script that runs every day at 2 p.m. If I were to double-click on this, we can see what it'll run, whether a user's logged on or not, and it'll run with the highest privileges so that it can access the files without being concerned about being denied access for NTFS permissions or something of this nature. Of course, some of that might be security sensitive as well. Then it can specify what triggers it. In this case, for example, it happens when the clock ticks at 2 o'clock. And then that's when it's going to be triggered. What actions will it take? Well, it will run this script when that takes place. What kind of conditions will take place? I can specify, and these pretty well explain themselves, but I could say start the task only if the computer is idle for a certain period of time. If I'm concerned that whatever the task might slow down the computer too long, or if it's a laptop, I might say only run it if the computer's on AC power. That, for example, is a good thing that you might specify if you're running a disk defragmenter or a full antivirus scan, because it has to churn that hard drive so much, it's going to pull a lot of power out of it. I know additional settings you can see here as well pretty well explain themselves, but one of the things, for example, would be if the task fails, how often to restart it. And how many times to attempt the restart, because something might be interrupting the task or prevent the task from running, and if it's important, you might want to give it a few more tries. This will give you a history of how many times it's run and any problems that might have occurred during that scan or during that time, and whether or not there were any errors and so forth. So that gives you a good idea there for what actual scheduled tasks might look like. And then getting back over here to computer management, we also see the event viewer. Now, this is going to be quite a lot different in Windows Vista than it was in Windows XP. And I'll kind of address briefly XP for you here in a little while as well. But big difference here is something that Microsoft calls Crimson. This is kind of their code name for the new way that they're doing events. Now they're all XML based. Okay, so all these events that we will be seeing here, you could custom modify those if you were adept at XML, and you could custom create your own kinds of views of the event viewer and so forth. However, I found that I don't really need to do that very much because the custom view capability that's already here is pretty good. One of the ones that appears by default is the administrative events, and this would show me critical error and warning events from the administrative log. So if I've been having problems and I don't want to have to dig through a bunch of event logs, many of the items of which might be completely innocuous or just informational, well, here I can just go right to the administrative events and find any errors or problems that I might have been having. Okay. For example, here I was trying to communicate earlier with one of my servers, and it just didn't work. I didn't really notice a problem there, but apparently there was one. So if I see errors like this frequently, and my user keeps saying that the connection to the server drops off, I might want to look into this and investigate this a little bit more detail. If you go to the Details tab, by the way, sometimes this will give you, let me just actually double-click it, because it'll be more real estate to look at here. Same thing here. I can look at the friendly view, and boy, isn't that informational, okay? Somewhere in here it says network connection dropped or something like that. Okay, I dare anyone to interpret that for me. So anyway, they say that it's the friendly view, but sometimes these things are possibly more trouble than they're really worth, just FYI. But the key thing here is that we're actually looking at this in binary data. So you're probably not going to get much use out of that unless you're working with some kind of a vendor that's capable of interpreting this, and maybe you're troubleshooting their specific product and so forth. Also, however, a lot of these items that you'll see will be very useful if you report them to Microsoft. Okay, because if you click on this, let me go over here. If you click on Event Log Help, Online Help, it will actually look up and see if there is a known problem with this particular event ID, and then it may give you additional clues there. So as I click on that item, it'll actually go to Microsoft's website to see if it has any known problems. And we see that we do have this event ID, which Microsoft does recognize as a problem that they might have some details about. So we see some information about this. This really is telling us that the remote procedure call service was unavailable. And then it tells you potential ways to resolve it. That might not have the answer, but it might sometimes get you started in at least going the right direction. So a very good usefulness here in the administrative events. Now, if you have other views you want to create, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with this because it kind of explains itself, but you can create a custom view and you can say, I only want to see critical errors, or I only want to see logs that are in a specific Windows log, like the security log. And then you can specify which sources you're interested in. What if it's something having to do with the SC manager, security, whatever else it is. And then you just keep on going through and add in the preferences that you have and click OK, and then it would customize the events for your purposes. And then here we have the Windows logs, which you'll commonly see in other versions of Windows as well, such as the application and security and system and so forth. This error right here, for example, is actually the same error that we saw under the Windows administrative events, that red exclamation point that we saw right there. So that's what that's about. Now, we don't really address this here in our particular nugget, but in our Windows Vista topics for CBT nuggets, we go into forwarded events. Just so you know what that is, you can set this up so that a computer somewhere else on the network will send its events to your computer. That's very handy. That way I can centrally collect a lot of forwarded events here without having to go visit each computer. They all get sent to me, and I can kind of monitor them centrally. And then as we move down here, we have a lot of very specific logs that appear down here, especially if we go down here to Microsoft and then Windows. And then you can see that there's a lot of different services and functions within Windows that you can get a lot of detailed information about. For example, well, let's just go to the first one, backup. I think I created a backup a while ago. And there it is. If you go to backup and then operational, this shows me specific details about the backup job that would not appear in the normal event logs that we would have here under application and system. So this would tell me probably exactly how much was backed up, some details about it. For example, it'll say here which volumes were backed up and how many bytes were, there it is, the number of total size. I wish they would have put comma separators in there, because I'd just about go cross-eyed trying to read that number. But anyway, at least it gives you the raw data. Now, by comparison, you can see here I'm in computer management for Windows XP, and the event viewer here, we have substantially less data to work with here. We still have the basic events, but we don't have any of those specific detailed items. Otherwise, most of the stuff that I've talked to you about is pretty much the same. These are not XML based, so they have less configurability. They also don't have those detailed events under Microsoft and Windows. They don't have forwarded events, and there's a lot of things here that are really lacking in comparison to the newer Windows Vista. But at least this is where you would get a raw information about the goings-on within your computer either way. Now let me also point out some things that we haven't really discussed particularly, although I think it's fairly evident. These are the three main logs that you would have in any edition of Windows, although as we saw earlier in Windows Vista, for example, there's some additional ones. But the purpose of these, application log is mainly for just that, any kind of an application that you might have. This refers also to various internal Windows applications. So for example, here you can see that the event log itself registered an application event log. So if we double click on this, we see that it says that, I don't know what it did, it's failed to fire the connection mode method. Okay, as usual, some of these are a little bit cryptic as to what in the world they mean until maybe you click on the link. But so we see that one. There's VMware Tools because that's what I'm using here. There's MSI Installer, so apparently I installed an application at that point. That's the kind of thing that goes on here, anything application specific. And then here we have security, which identifies, successful or failed logon attempts. Here I'm not auditing anything, so that there's nothing to really show there right now. And then we have system as well. This relates to the operating system in general, and it would identify things, for example, if I were having trouble with getting an IP address from the DHCP server. Like this right here. Okay, so apparently I was not able to get a DHCP address or an IP address from that. Talk more about DHCP and IP addresses at a later point in time as well. Also, the system does synchronize its clock with either an external time source or a domain controller. So here it was telling me that it was synchronizing with a time source. Okay, and this is going to be a public internet time source that it was able to sync with. That's how it makes sure that it keeps the proper time. Anyway, so you can see here that these are operating system. When you think of system, think of operating system related items. Security, of course, security related items, and application items here as well. Now, the next thing I want to really show you here is that you can also clear events if you want to. You can clear all events, and it'll prompt you. Do you want to save system before clearing it? I'm going to cancel this. But this would be important, especially for some logs that you wanted to keep track of, like a historical record of all of the events that were taking place on that system. Most of the time for consumer PCs or user desktops, that's not important usually at all. We sometimes do this for critical servers. And some organizations I know of have to keep track of every log that's ever been made of their server from the time it was first turned on. But we don't really care that too much about that for our current purposes. And then here you can also say, what you want to do is to go to the properties of this. This is kind of an important item here as well. And in this one, you can specify the maximum log size. Now, this is something I would just know about. Most of this explains itself pretty well. But you can say, hey, we got a lot of system events going on, and it keeps filling up way before the week is even out. And so we need to increase that. Maybe you want to make it 1,024, or 2,048. It doesn't have to be an even megabyte number, but you get the idea there. Just however big you think is reasonable, and it's somewhat arbitrary. And of course, it's in kilobytes here. Since we have a lot of hard drive space these days, you can usually make that a little bit more sizable if you want. You can also override events as needed. What does that mean? Well, when I get to the limit of my kilobyte size here, then what happens? Well, it'll overwrite starting with the oldest event and keep on moving forward at that point. So it's kind of a circular logging event that takes place that way. You can also not overwrite events only if they're older than 7 days. So if I had a very, very busy day in the system, and for example, some strange things were going on, and I fill this all up within 1 day, then it would not overwrite the older events because none of them are older than 7 days. Okay. You can also say do not overwrite events, and if you do this one, you'll have to clear the log manually before it will start to accept additional events. And you can do these same settings, as you can see here, for any of these other items here as well. Same exact stuff that we see going on here for all the other ones as well. And then down here we see shared folders, and if we expand this out, you can see any shares that have been created on this computer. These are all default administrative shares, but if I had, a data folder that was shared, that would also appear here, of course. Any sessions would be anybody that's currently connected to this computer by some type of a share. And then again, of course, remember, for A+ purposes, any Windows client can only support a total of 10 concurrently connected sessions at one time. Then you can see also if anybody's got any open files to your system. And this all appears the same on XP as well as it does on Vista. And then for local users and groups, we looked at that in a previous nugget not too long ago, so we won't really readdress that one. Here we have performance logs and alerts. This is a good way to get an idea for how the system is performing. If I do, for example, a counter log, then if we expand this out, you can see this is going to give me a system overview. This is kind of some pre-configured settings that will identify things such as the processor utilization and other things. I can start this by just clicking the Start button up here, and then it will start to log the activity on this computer for a little while. Then once I'm done logging it, or if I think I've come to a point where I'm pretty well done with it, then I'll go ahead and stop this item, and it'll create the log for me. And then if you want to know some specifics about this item, for example, what exactly it's logging, you can double click on it and it'll show you it's logging for memory pages per second. That's important to identify whether or not you have enough memory in the system. And if you don't, it's going to have to swap out to the page file. That's where we're getting our pages, so that it's not able to find what it needs in memory and it has to go to the hard drive. The average queue length, this is where the disk is waiting for some free time before it can read or write data to or from the disk. So if it's very busy, then you're going to get a longer queue, just like when you're at the post office and you're trying to mail a package. If there's a lot of people in queue or in line, then you know they're very busy. Same kind of thing here. Processor time as well, of course, simply meaning that an indicator of how busy the CPU is. And then switching over here to Windows Vista, you'll see that the reliability and performance is, again, generationally, a big step forward in terms of identifying the performance of your systems. So, for example, when I click on this, without expanding it, because you can expand all this out, it gives me just a resource overview of my CPU, disk, network, and memory. Okay, these are the 4 key things that affect the performance of a computer, and I can click on CPU and see what's using the most CPU utilization, for example. Right now, there's not a whole lot going on. Looks like network is a little busier, though, doesn't it? If I click on this, it tells me what exactly is using this, and if we take a look at it, notice what's going on here. It's communicating with the computer called James Win 764, and it's sending and receiving some data. You know why that is? Because I'm actually using a remote desktop connection to shoot this. We'll talk more about remote desktop and remote assistance later on, but you can see here if I move this window down, notice that I'm actually using a remote desktop connection here. You probably thought you were looking at a physical computer. I'm actually looking at this across the network connection. I'm actually looking at it on a I'm actually looking at this Windows Vista computer on a Windows 7 machine. So it's sending network traffic back and forth to display all the graphic elements to me so that I can see what I'm doing. And then we have a performance monitor here as well. Now we will have this, and this is very similar in all versions of Windows, all current versions. So there's not a whole lot that's new here, again, except that if you save it, it can save it in an XML format. But here I would again click on Add, and I would add in whatever it is that I was interested in, monitoring, and then click OK. And we can see then now that we have lots of different processor counters here. For example, the total processor time. If you have a little trouble seeing the forest for the trees, so to speak. For example, it's kind of hard to identify. Is that red or is that a bright pink? What is that? Then you can press Control H, and then notice that what it'll do is, it's kind of hard to see still, but it puts a bold highlight on that particular counter. So let's go to one that's a little bit more visible. This one I had here, for example. If I Control H that one, that's still not it either. I'm trying to find one that you can, there we go. Here, the DPC is queued per second. So this talks about the queue of the processor. And again, this shows me a little bit more activity than I might otherwise get. Now this is probably not an A+ exam objective item, but I think you might want to look at reliability monitor here too. I really like this a lot. I'm going to go ahead and share it with you anyway. This gives me kind of a charted snapshot of how this computer's been performing over time. And there might be a trend where it starts off performing at a high level, like maybe up at 10, and then over time it starts to trend downwards. That might happen after I installed a new driver that causes system crashes all the time or something like that. Now, of course, in this one, there's not a lot to show because it's a virtual machine, which is off most of the time unless I'm teaching. So I thought I'd just go ahead and go to Windows 7 and open up my Windows 7 version of the same thing. Most of this is the same between 7 and Vista, so I'll just give you something else to look at here. But here we can see that we were trending higher, as time was going by, it seemed like we weren't getting any crashes or anything, so it improved a bit. But then we had a crash this day, and so we dipped down. And you can see that the more crashes I would have of various types, the more it would start to dip down. And if I go over here, for example, it says, Lightroom 64-bit stopped working. Windows Explorer stopped working. Actually, we usually call that Windows Exploder because it's kind of a frustration, but that very often is something that stops responding. And then I recall also that day I had a video hardware error. Something about the driver stopped responding somehow or another as well, and it did recover. But you can see, with a couple of different critical failures there, that really dropped my trending down. So that's kind of the idea for what this whole thing is if you get the same errors that keep popping up and causing your reliability to go down, then you're able to identify potentially the source of a problem. Now here then, let's switch on down to services. And this is going to identify various services that run on your computer. What is a service, first of all? For the most part, they are kind of like programs that can run whether or not somebody is logged on to the computer, and it can perform certain actions, again, whether or not someone's logged on. It doesn't usually require any interaction on the user's part, and they usually run in the background. So for example, here's the DHCP client. This allows me to get a TCP/IP address on this computer, and I need to do that, of course, even if I haven't logged on. And in fact, I have to get one before I log on if I'm in a domain, because I have to have an IP address so that I can contact the domain controller to authenticate my credentials. Well, so obviously this has started, and we can see the startup type is automatic. Let's go ahead and double click on that to get a better look at it. With services, you have several different startup types. Automatic delayed start, which is new in Windows Vista, and what this does is it will still start up automatically, but it will allow other processes and other services to start ahead of it, and then when the operating system seems to be less busy, it'll go ahead and start. Then there's automatic, which will just start up as soon as it can. Manual, which means you have to manually start it. And then disabled altogether. Okay. And then you can also stop this service if you want to. For example, I'm stopping the client right now. And then once that's done, I can also then start it as well. Many of these will also have a command line equivalent. For example, there's also a print spooler back here. If I could get the window to show back up again. There's a print spooler back there. And I could right-click on that to also choose to stop it. Or I could go to a command prompt and type net stop spooler and then net start spooler as well. And then in the Logon tab here, it identifies who has to be logged on in order for the service to start. Now you're saying, James, I thought you said nobody had to log on. Well, that's true. But when we specify something in here, then it will log these on in the background, even without a specific human being logged onto the system. So in this case, it'll use the local service account. And this is something that's a little bit different. In the older versions of Windows, you'd only have the system account or a specific actual user account that you could use. Well, now the local service account has the ability of closing some certain loopholes that the system account would have. See, the system account can do everything. It's actually even more powerful than the administrator account. So if I log on as the system account and someone exploits this service and potentially also gets access to the system account, then they can do catastrophic damage to my computer. So with Windows 7, we have this new item called the local service, which still will start the services as necessary, but it doesn't open up the same exploits because it doesn't also have full control over a lot of the other components within Windows. And then for recovery, and these kind of explain themselves, but this just identifies what to do in a first, second, or subsequent failures. What do you want to do? You want to restart the service or run a specific program. This might be a program that would send a message to you or something like that. Sometimes this will depend upon third-party products that monitor various services, and when it finds out that they have failed, then you can specify this to run a program, and it will send a message or a text message to your phone or whatever. That sort of thing can take place. And so you can see those things as well as the dependencies. Now, this is going to be important because some of these other dependencies, if they fail, then the DHCP client won't be able to work either. So if it looks like the DHCP client service itself is healthy and yet, for some reason we cannot seem to get it started, check these other items to see if some of those are failing as well. Now let's switch up here to Device Manager, and we've looked at Device Manager a few times in other nuggets because, of course, it has a lot to do with our hardware, and we've addressed a lot of those in previous nuggets. So when we take a look at this should identify everything that Windows sees in the system. And ideally, you want to have no exclamation points like I've got right here. So this is showing me that I do have some kind of a problem. Let's go to the properties of this and see what it says. It says that it stopped because it reported problems. Well, interesting. One thing you can do with this is to check for solutions. I happen to know what the solution is in this case. And that would be to update what we call VMware tools. If you look down here in the tray area, notice that I have a little icon there with it's a VMware symbol with a little exclamation point on it. Well, that's simply telling me that I could update my VMware tools, and that would also give me the later version of these drivers, which would be just fine. So for this one at least, we know what the solution would be. You're not always that fortunate, however. Now, some other things you might see in this might be disabled. So for example, I'm not using the floppy disk drive anyway. But if for some reason I suspected that the floppy disk driver was causing me a problem, very often what I'll do is deliberately disable it. And it will cause it to stop functioning, of course. And I'll click on yes. Now, if I haven't mentioned this before, drivers are simply the interface between the physical hardware and the operating system. It's what allows data to be sent back and forth between the two. Now, if I disable this floppy disk drive, then that means that the operating system can no longer use that disk drive. But again, I might find out now that my problems go away. And if that's the case, then I've narrowed down that the problem has something to do with this floppy disk drive. And if it was on a physical computer, I'd probably just jerk the thing out of there and throw it away. I hate these things. But anyway, if I have to have it and I need to re-enable it, then of course I'll right-click and choose Enable. Now notice also that we do have the ability here to update driver software. You can search automatically for updated driver software. What it's going to do, it's going to look for drivers in any of your local locations first. For example, in Windows, it has a lot of default drivers that already appear there, and that may get updated with service packs, by the way. So in older versions of Windows, it would not download every driver that Microsoft knew about. But nowadays, there's between 50, 60, 70 megabytes maybe of drivers that are put on the hard drive by default with all installations of Windows. And that's because hard drives are large nowadays, and 50 megabytes or so is not that much of a sacrifice anymore. So we'll look in my local driver store, and then it'll look in any CD-ROMs, for example, that I also have attached. If it doesn't find anything there, then it can also go out to the internet to search for drivers as well. And when you say internet, normally it checks with Windows Update to find those. Alternatively, of course, we could browse the local computer for those drivers as well. One thing you might also want to do is to simply uninstall the device. Now, why would I want to do that? Well, that would certainly be the case if I had specific drivers that were causing me catastrophic problems and that seemed to load every time I booted Windows and things of this nature. Well, in that case, I might just need to get rid of it entirely, and then we would notice here that we don't have that floppy disk drive anymore. Still have the controller, but not the floppy disk drive. Now, if I need to bring it back, maybe I found out that that wasn't what was causing the problem in the first place and I need that device back, I can scan for hardware changes. And having done that, it should then detect that additional floppy disk and perform a reinstallation. And so then you'll see that here we have floppy disk drives that has come back again after it has rescanned the system for hardware. Now, another thing you might want to take a look at here, sometimes various devices will not appear here in Device Manager, but you suspect that they would be causing a problem where you happen to have knowledge of a particular device. What you can do with this is to go over here to Device Manager, choose View, and then Show Hidden Devices. Now, not all of these will be relevant. Notice that, for example, when I did that, it showed non-plug-and-play drivers. These are system types of drivers that usually don't cause problems in the first place, and they're things that you kind of have to just live with, pretty much. But they're hidden because there's no configuration for them anyway. In fact, let's go back to one of them. Let's just go to, whatever this thing is, the beep. Notice that there's no configuration options that I can use with this. It's not like some of the other devices where you assign an interrupt request or an I/O address or any of those things. It's just kind of there, and it has a driver, and that's it. Okay, so that's what those sorts of things are about. Certain other devices might be system devices that, again, might not normally appear if we had not shown hidden devices. Again, most of those things you can't mess with very much either. Most of the types of devices you'll be working with in terms of addressing driver issues and resources would be mostly field replaceable unit types of devices, like disk drives, video cards, sound cards, storage controllers, things of this nature. And then another useful view of this that you might see sometimes is if you go here, you can show devices, by connection and see what they're connected to. For example, all of these things hang off of the Advanced Configuration Power interface-based PC. So that's just one way of looking at it. We don't really have a lot of call for that. I think you're going to see that more often you're going to look at resources by type, and that would probably be one that you'll see more often, and you'll very likely want to go into the interrupt request items that we addressed earlier. Although, once again, we don't really have very much reason to be here anymore nowadays because interrupt requests are so much easier to manage than they used to be. And then finally, you can go resources by connection as well, and you can see what is connected to interrupt requests in this view as well. In this nugget, we took a look at various Windows tools and diagnostics. We started off by some of the run-line utilities that you can use, and these are mostly for gathering information. They don't actually fix anything. They just tell you information about your system and software and various hardware and the like. We also took a look at some administrative tools such as My Network Places, but the biggest part of this really all falls under computer management because of course it contains things such as performance monitor, event viewer, services, device manager, a lot of those different tools that you'll use to diagnose Windows. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.